The last thing I expected after a grueling 12-hour shift was to find my own driveway barricaded. Two reflective cones flanked a cartoonishly official-looking no parking sign stuck right in front of my garage door, as though it were a sovereign border post. Funny how you can spend decades protecting your city, only to come home and realize your own neighborhood has turned into a miniature police state, an HOA with more zeal for petty rules than I'd seen in actual hardened criminals. If you've ever questioned the power of your local homeowners association, keep reading. This story might just save you from a similar headache. I paused at the curb, killed the engine, and rolled down my window to investigate. At first, I thought a road crew had made a mistake, but the bright orange stripes on the sign bore our HOA's logo, a stylized oak tree draped in gold. A stout man in a neon vest emerged from behind a large hedge. He didn't look like a policeman, more like a mall cop auditioning for a role in a movie. A clipboard in hand, he cleared his throat. "You can't park here, sir," he announced, pointing at the empty space in my own driveway with the authority of someone who believed he was judge, jury, and executioner of Maplewood Estates. "We've issued a citation, and until you settle it, this space is off limits." I resisted the urge to flash my actual badge. Experience taught me that brandishing authority in your own neighborhood can sour relationships fast. I'd only recently moved to Maplewood Estates, hoping for a peaceful place to call home after being named chief of police in a nearby district. My job was stressful enough. The last thing I wanted was more drama. So, I took a breath, mustered a polite tone, and asked, "You mind telling me what citation you're talking about?" He thumbed through his clipboard. "Mr. Alexander Reed, correct?" "That's me." I nodded, leaning out the window. "You, sir, have an unpaid fine of $79, slapped on you for installing an unapproved decorative fixture on your front lawn." He said this as though he were reading out a murder charge. It's been overdue for a week. I tried to parse what he meant. Unapproved decorative fixture? As far as I knew, the only thing I'd put on my lawn was a small wooden statue my father carved decades ago, a policeman figurine, a nod to my chosen profession, and a sentimental piece that had survived 3 house moves. It was discreet and sat by the flower bed, hardly bigger than a garden gnome. I'd heard stories about HOAs cracking down on folks for everything from mailbox color to wind chimes, but I never dreamed something so small would cause an uproar. "Look, I just got off work. I'm a little tired." I gave a weary smile. "Could you let me park, and I'll sort out any misunderstanding tomorrow?" The man scrunched up his face. "Not without clearance from the HOA compliance officer," he replied and tapped a name badge pinned to his shirt. "Terry Chambers, Maplewood Estate Security." He drew the word security out as if it were a weapon. A wave of annoyance prickled at the back of my neck, but I forced myself to keep calm. I wasn't aware I was in violation. No letter. No phone call. "Are you sure you have the right address? I've lived here barely 2 months, and that statue has been there since I moved in." Terry flipped through his paperwork. "Says here a compliance inspection was done 2 weeks ago." He paused, reading. "The property at 817 Maple Grove was found to have an unapproved ornamental figurine that does not align with the aesthetic guidelines. A $79 fine has been assessed. Payment was due last Friday." I glanced at the sign blocking my driveway. "And that gives the HOA permission to block my garage." He shrugged. "Rule 14.6. If you're in arrears on any fines, you can be subjected to immediate compliance actions. And that includes limiting access to communal or driveway property. Your driveway, technically, is part of the communal frontage." He quoted the bylaw like a devout follower citing scripture. For a moment, I contemplated pulling rank, informing him that I was the newly appointed chief of police in Oak City, the district that encompassed Maplewood Estates. But the man was just doing what he was told. Overzealous, sure, but in his eyes, it was black and white. If you break a rule, you pay or suffer the consequences. "Fine," I relented with forced politeness. "I'll pay the $79 right now if it gets me into my own garage." Terry's eyebrows arched. "I'm not authorized to accept payment. You have to go through the HOA office. They're closed until Monday. That meant it would be at least 48 hours before I could park on my own property, or so they claimed." My SUV, battered from years of stakeouts, sat sputtering at the curb as though it resented the indignity of being forced to wait there. Is there someone I can talk to right now? An emergency number. He pursed his lips. Might be able to get the compliance officer's cell, but she rarely answers after 5. She's also off on weekends. He sounded genuinely sorry, but not sorry enough to budge. I took a deep breath, stepping out of my vehicle. Okay, just let me talk to a board member or something. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. Without another word, Terry handed me a small card with the HOA's main line. Then he repositioned his no parking sign so that it perfectly aligned with the middle of my driveway, giving me a meaningful look. Sorry, sir. Rules are rules. He returned to his vantage point behind the hedge, presumably so he could ensure I didn't try to sneak my SUV around the cones and into the garage. My impulse was to do exactly that, but I remembered my training. Pick your battles. And right now, my battle was with the invisible folks who wrote these rules, not the foot soldier enforcing them. So, I trudged inside, a swirl of irritation and disbelief fueling each step. I dropped my keys on the foyer table, stared at the framed photo of my late father who'd carved that little statue, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. The house was quiet, too quiet, as I realized I might be in for a weekend of calls, messages, and frustration to rectify a $79 fiasco. And the so-called HOA cops who blocked my driveway? They had no idea they were tangling with the actual chief of police. Something told me this wouldn't be resolved easily. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind churned through worst-case scenarios about towing trucks and weekend standoffs, visions that seemed more fitting for a high-stakes hostage situation than a suburban dispute. After years on the force, I'd navigated plenty of conflicts, from armed standoffs to intricate negotiation tactics. Yet somehow, crossing swords with an HOA felt uniquely draining. Perhaps because it struck at home, a place that should be your refuge. Early Saturday morning, I decided to do a bit of sleuthing. If the compliance officer was unreachable, perhaps the HOA president or someone else could be found. Maplewood Estates' official website listed 3 board members. The president, Mark Jenkins, was a name I'd seen scribbled on those shiny pamphlets about neighborhood watch programs and community synergy. Next to his name was a staged portrait that made him look like a candidate for local office. Broad smile, perfect hair, hands neatly folded. I should have known, I muttered, scanning the site. It was full of lofty mission statements, maintaining property values, safeguarding aesthetics, fostering a friendly community. Yet nowhere did it say they had the right to blockade a law-abiding resident from his own garage over a minor fine. Tucked away in the site's labyrinth of pages was a phone number for urgent compliance issues. I dialed it, steeling myself for a confrontation. To my surprise, Mark Jenkins himself answered on the 3rd ring. Hello. His voice was bright, probably too bright for 7 a.m. on a Saturday. I explained who I was, my address, and the problem. He listened with polite murmurs. Well, Mr. Reed, he said once I finished my rundown, HOA guidelines are quite explicit. If a homeowner is in arrears, we have the authority to restrict certain privileges. And you think blocking my driveway is the best approach? I asked, choosing my words carefully. I'm not refusing to pay. I'm just taken aback that you'd go to such extremes without warning. He paused. We sent a notice via certified mail. It must have gone out about a week ago. Did you not receive it? No, I said, an edge creeping into my tone. If I had, I would have taken care of this. I'm not in the habit of dodging bills, especially not for something as trivial as $79. Mark's voice softened. We can't make exceptions, you see. The integrity of our HOA depends on consistent enforcement. Let me talk to our compliance officer and see if I can expedite the process. Maybe we can at least remove the blockade if you agree to pay promptly on Monday. Relief flickered. That would be great, but I can't promise anything, he hedged, as our officer is the one who oversees these matters. I thanked him, hung up, and paced my living room. Something about Mark's tone suggested he wasn't the real villain here. He was a bureaucrat in a fancy suit, sure, but he seemed open to reason. Maybe this was all some new compliance officer's attempt to prove their mettle. HOAs do attract the occasional power tripper. Trying to calm my nerves, I brewed coffee and flipped through the local news channels, half watching coverage on city events, half brooding over the fiasco in my driveway. A segment about our police department hiring new recruits caught my eye. They showed a clip from our swearing-in ceremony a week back, and I saw myself on screen, shaking hands with the mayor. That moment had filled me with a sense of pride and responsibility. My father used to say, "Title is not power, it's duty." I wondered what he'd think of my current predicament. Ironically powerless to park in my own driveway. A chime from my phone startled me out of my thoughts. A text from an unknown number read, "Heard there's a problem at your place. I can help. Meet me at the community garden at 10 a.m. Kevin." I frowned. Kevin who? Then I recalled a neighbor, Kevin Miles, who'd introduced himself when I first moved in. A friendly older gentleman who mentioned he used to be on the HOA board. Maybe he'd offer some inside intel on how to untangle this mess. Shortly before 10, I parked on the street near the community garden and walked over. Kevin was easy to spot in his wide-brimmed hat, pruning some basil in one of the raised beds. A retired high school teacher, he always had a calm presence. "Alex, thanks for coming," he greeted, tucking his pruning shears into a leather holster. "Heard about your situation. Word travels fast around here." He pointed to a wooden bench in a shady spot under a large oak tree. We sat down, the garden's fragrance a surprising balm to my frustration. "I'm guessing you know something about how to resolve HOA trouble," I said, glancing around to ensure no curious ears were listening. Kevin sighed. "I served on the board for 7 years. Saw it go from a congenial group of neighbors trying to keep the area nice to a clique of overzealous enforcers with a bloated rulebook. It got especially bad after we hired a new property management company. That's when these petty fines started popping up." I shook my head. It's amazing how quickly power can corrupt a simple system. You'd be surprised. A year ago, they tried to fine me for having a hedgerow that was 3 inches taller than the stated guidelines. 3 inches. He let out a dry laugh. It turned into a drawn-out battle. I ended up trimming the hedge just to be done with it. But the principle really irked me. I told him about the blockade, the statue, the $79 fine, and Mark Jenkins' half-promise. Kevin rubbed his chin. "If Mark's involved, you might have a chance. He's more reasonable than most, but the compliance officer, Cassandra Ryan, is notorious for wielding her authority like a sledgehammer. If she has a chip on her shoulder about you, she might push for a bigger spectacle." A bigger spectacle was the last thing I needed. I thanked Kevin for the background and assured him I'd keep him in the loop. As we parted ways, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Remember, man, you're the chief of police. You know how to de-escalate. Just don't let them bully you either." His words stayed with me. Sure, I could leverage my title, call up a squad car, or file a harassment complaint, but those tactics felt like using a cannon to swat a fly. Part of me just wanted to pay the fine and avoid a headache. Another part of me, the part that believed in fairness, insisted on sorting out the issue the right way. If I let them strong-arm me today, they'd feel justified to do it to the next person tomorrow. Back at home, Terry was still out there, planted near the no parking sign. Occasionally, he'd patrol up and down the sidewalk as though anticipating a burglary. I tried to ignore him, burying myself in some overdue paperwork for the station. The day crawled by with no word from Mark Jenkins or the compliance officer. By nightfall, I realized my SUV was still parked curbside half a block away, and that unshakable tension returned. Who would have thought a wooden statue, a simple tribute to my father, could cause such a ruckus? And how many more neighbors were dealing with these petty intrusions? I resolved that if I hadn't heard from Mark by morning, I'd take matters into my own hands. Because whether the HOA liked it or not, I had the law on my side, and I was just about ready to enforce it. Sunday dawned bright and deceptively peaceful. I busied myself with household chores and a quick jog, half hoping to see any sign that the HOA blockade had been removed. No luck. Terry Chambers was gone, but his cones and that accusatory sign were still stationed in front of my driveway. Around noon, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed it was Mark Jenkins. "Mr. Reed, I have some good news," he began. "I managed to convince Cassandra that forcing you to park on the street all weekend might be excessive. She's agreed to allow you to remove the blockade on one condition." I let out a short breath. "I'm listening." "You need to meet with her at the HOA office tomorrow morning, pay the fine, and sign a statement acknowledging the violation. Cassandra insists on a formal signature for the record. I gritted my teeth. So you're telling me this blockade could be removed right now? Yes, Mark said. All you have to do is sign an interim compliance agreement and promise to pay first thing Monday. I couldn't help but feel a flutter of relief. I'll do it. If it got them off my back for the day, I was happy to scribble my name on a piece of paper and pay the full amount first thing in the morning. Great, Mark replied, though his tone carried a note of caution. Cassandra wants to hand you the form herself, so she's swinging by your place within the hour. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. I was relieved, but also wary. Something told me Cassandra Ryan was not the sort to bend easily. Sure enough, less than an hour later, a silver sedan glided down the street and parked with an air of self-importance in front of my house. Out stepped a woman in her mid-40s, with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Dressed in a tailored blazer, she looked more like a corporate executive than a neighborhood volunteer. She marched up my walkway, file folder under her arm, and rang the doorbell twice. I opened the door with a polite nod. Ms. Ryan? Mr. Reed, she said crisply, extending a hand. Her grip was strong, almost defiant. I have your compliance papers. I trust Mark explained the arrangement. We sat down in my living room. Cassandra began listing the infractions like she was reciting a code of ethics. Rule 3.4 on lawn ornaments and decorative displays. Rule 5.1 on timely remittance of fines. She punctuated each reference with a click of her pen. I try not to roll my eyes. Just point me to where I need to sign, I said, hoping to cut the lecture short. She laid a document on the coffee table. Right there. This states you acknowledge placing an unapproved ornament on the property. You understand it violates the guidelines. And you agree to pay the associated fee by tomorrow at 10 a.m. I scanned the document. It seemed straightforward enough, except for the final paragraph that stated, the homeowner acknowledges that any further infractions, including but not limited to delayed payment of this fine, could result in escalated measures up to and including a lien on the property. A lien? I set the paper down. That's a bit extreme for a $79 ornament violation, isn't it? Cassandra met my gaze without flinching. Our rules are only effective if we enforce them. And yes, a lien is a last resort, but we like to make sure homeowners understand the consequences. I nodded slowly, picking up my pen. Understood. I scribbled my signature, fully aware I was stepping into their labyrinth of regulations. But I had a plan of my own, one that involved shining a brighter light on these heavy-handed tactics. There, I said, handing the paper to Cassandra. Now, I assume you'll remove the barricade? She stood, smoothing her blazer. I'll instruct our security staff to collect the cones and sign immediately. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Reed. We aim to keep Maplewood Estates beautiful and orderly. With that, she gave a tight-lipped smile and departed. I watched her pull away, feeling a swirl of relief and mounting resolve. Paying the fine would be easy. The bigger issue was the principle of what they'd done. Blocking someone's driveway over a minor fee? Threatening liens at the drop of a hat? Their approach felt more like intimidation than community caretaking. True to her word, within 30 minutes, Terry Chambers arrived in his neon vest, solemnly gathered the cones, and loaded them into a golf cart. I resisted the urge to gloat, stepping outside just to confirm the blockade was gone. He gave me a nod that was part acknowledgement, part reluctant farewell, then puttered away. Finally, my driveway was mine again. I wasted no time moving my SUV inside, feeling a surprising wave of relief. You never realize how essential something as simple as your own driveway can be until it's denied to you. But as I locked up the garage, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my lieutenant from Oak City PD, Manny Garcia. "Boss," he said cheerfully, "just checking in about tomorrow's meeting with the mayor. You still good to join us at City Hall at noon?" I'd nearly forgotten. The mayor wanted a strategic overview of our policing initiatives for the next quarter, community outreach, new training protocols, the works. A big part of the job I was proud to lead. "Wouldn't miss it," I told Manny. Before hanging up, he asked, "Everything okay, Chief? You sound a bit preoccupied." I hesitated. Manny was more than just my lieutenant. He was a friend. But the idea of telling him about my scuffle with the HOA felt odd, like complaining about a stub toe to someone who's fighting a forest fire. I'm fine, I lied with a chuckle. Just dealing with some neighborhood nonsense. I'll fill you in sometime. Understood. See you tomorrow. After we ended the call, I realized I might need that conversation sooner than later. If the HOA insisted on pushing me around with petty tactics, I had the resources to fight back. Legally, ethically, and publicly if need be. Part of me wanted to keep it private, but part of me knew this could be a tipping point for Maplewood Estates, a cautionary tale that might help other residents who were afraid to speak up. I found myself thinking back to Kevin's words, just don't let them bully you. Maybe the best way to ensure that was to show them exactly who I was and what I stood for. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the chief of police, and I had a duty to protect my community from tyranny, even if it came in the form of an HOA. Tomorrow, after paying that fine, I'd set my plan in motion. Monday arrived with a crisp dawn, and I headed straight to the HOA office first thing. Located in a modest brick building next to Maplewood's community pool, it had a freshly painted sign reading Maplewood Estates, where community thrives. Inside, I found Cassandra at a small reception desk, sorting through a stack of folders. "Mr. Reed," she greeted with a reserved nod. Prompt, "I see. I've got a busy day," I replied, pulling out my checkbook. "So let's settle this." Her demeanor remained cool as she accepted my payment, $79. I added a note on the memo line, "Statute fine." For good measure, I asked for a receipt. She handed one over without fanfare. "All done," she said, confirming the deposit. Then she glanced at me. "I trust the statue is removed?" I exhaled, meeting her gaze. "I moved it temporarily to my garage, yes. But that statue was my father's carving. Sentimental. I'd like to see if there's a formal way to apply for an exemption." Cassandra shrugged. "You can fill out a decorative exception form, but I can't promise approval. We hold monthly board meetings. You're welcome to attend and plead your case." I nodded, resisting the urge to engage in a more spirited debate. "All right, I'll do that." For now, I had bigger plans, namely attending the mayor's meeting. As I turned to leave, I added casually, "I appreciate you handling this promptly. I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon." She offered a thin-lipped smile. "Likewise." A couple of hours later, I was standing in the mayor's office, a stately room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Oak City's skyline. The meeting was straightforward. Discussion on community-oriented policing, new recruitment strategies, and fostering trust between law enforcement and residents. Toward the end, the mayor leaned forward, hands clasped. "Chief Reed, I'd like to propose a new outreach initiative where we work with local HOAs to build better relations between the police department and the neighborhoods. Some of these associations can be quite influential." I almost laughed at the irony. I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, I have a personal experience with an HOA matter that might help shape our approach. The mayor's eyebrows arched with curiosity. "Care to elaborate?" I glanced at Manny, who gave me a supportive nod. "Let's just say, Mr. Mayor, that I have insight into how an HOA can misuse enforcement power. I think we can develop guidelines that balance residents' rights with the association's desire for order." "Excellent," the mayor said, smiling. "Let's make it a priority. I want to see a draft proposal in a few weeks." When the meeting wrapped, Manny and I stepped into the hallway. "Guess you weren't kidding about the neighborhood nonsense, huh, Chief?" he joked. "Not at all," I replied, filling him in on the broad strokes. Manny's eyes widened at the driveway blockade story. "You can't make this stuff up," I said, shaking my head. "They basically took the law into their own hands." "Maybe it's time the law paid them a visit," Manny quipped. I chuckled, though part of me was seriously considering it. Let's keep it measured. But yeah, I'm thinking of attending the next HOA board meeting, shining a light on their methods. Might do some good for the other residents. Manny patted my shoulder. "You just say the word if you need official backup, Chief." That evening, I spread out the Maplewood Estates rulebook on my dining table, the same one they gave every new resident. For the first time, I read it in detail, 36 pages of legalese, small print, and references to municipal codes. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. The HOA had the right to restrict access to common areas if fines went unpaid. It didn't explicitly say they could block a driveway, but apparently they'd interpreted restrict access to the letter. I marked a few questionable clauses and made a list of concerns. By the time I was done, it felt like I was prepping for a court case. If the board was going to hide behind these rules, I wanted to be armed with facts and a firm grasp of the law. Over the next week, I quietly gathered stories from neighbors. Kevin put me in touch with a few residents who'd faced similar strong-arm tactics. A retired couple got slapped with a fine for having a bird bath that was 2 inches taller than the standard. A single mother was threatened with legal action over a garden fence that wasn't painted in an approved color. It painted a picture of an HOA run amok, more concerned with micromanaging aesthetics than fostering true community. Finally, the night of the monthly HOA board meeting arrived. The clubhouse was bustling, with at least 50 residents packed into folding chairs. Usually, these gatherings drew a small crowd, but word had spread that the new police chief had a bone to pick with the board. I spotted Cassandra near the front, stiff posture betraying no emotion. Mark Jenkins hovered by the refreshments, offering polite smiles. Terry Chambers was conspicuously absent. The meeting started with routine agenda items, budget approvals, landscaping updates, plans for a summer barbecue. Then the floor opened for community input. I stood, cleared my throat, and introduced myself. Alex Reed, homeowner at 817 Maple Grove. I'd like to address some recent actions by the compliance officer regarding fine enforcement. Murmurs spread through the room, and I sensed a few nods of encouragement from neighbors who knew what was coming. Keeping my tone level, I recounted the driveway blockade situation. No dramatics, just facts. I'd received no initial notice, faced an arbitrary fine, was denied access to my own driveway, and threatened with further consequences. As chief of police, I concluded, I'm well aware of the importance of rules. But rules should protect and serve a community, not harass and intimidate residents. The question here is whether this association's tactics align with fair practice. Cassandra stood, looking more irritated than rattled. Mr. Reed, we follow the protocols laid out in the bylaws which you, as a homeowner, agreed to when you moved here. I held up a copy of the rulebook. Except those bylaws don't explicitly sanction blocking a resident's driveway without due notice. What they do mention is restricting access to common areas, and I would argue that my personal driveway is not a purely common area. Moreover, the requirement for proper written notice before enforcement is also in here. I tapped the pages. A ripple of murmuring spread through the crowd again. Some folks clapped softly. Cassandra's face tightened. Mark Jenkins, the board president, cleared his throat and stepped up. Let's keep this civil, he said, offering a placating gesture. We appreciate Mr. Reed's perspective, and we understand the situation could have been handled more smoothly. More smoothly, a voice called from the back. My garden fence was nearly torn down last month. Another resident chimed in. They threatened me with a lien for having an American flag that was deemed oversized by 6 inches. The stories poured out, each more startling than the last. Mark shot Cassandra a pained look. We may need to revisit our enforcement procedures, he admitted. I propose we form a committee to review these issues. In the meantime, perhaps we can suspend certain enforcement measures until the committee's findings are presented. The tension in the room eased as a sense of victory hung in the air. People clapped and cheered quietly, relieved that someone was finally challenging the heavy hand of the HOA. Cassandra glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Then she set her jaw and nodded. If that's the consensus of the board, I'll cooperate. Mark offered a formal nod. Thank you, Ms. Ryan, and thank you, everyone, for your input. Meeting adjourned. I lingered afterward, chatting with neighbors who wanted to share their relief, gratitude, or further horror stories. Kevin caught my arm and grinned. You did it, Chief. They'll think twice before messing with folks now. I smiled, humble but satisfied. One small step, Kev. We'll see how the committee shakes out. But I'm optimistic. As I walked home that night, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Not just because I'd saved myself from future parking blocking stunts, but because we'd ignited a spark of change. Maybe Maplewood Estates would remember its true purpose, fostering a sense of belonging, not fear. In the days that followed, the board officially put a moratorium on driveway blockades and introduced a more transparent process for issuing fines. I also filed a formal request to display my father's statue, citing its historical and personal significance. And you know what? A week later, I received an approval letter with a friendly note from Mark Jenkins, apologizing for the unfortunate misunderstanding. With that, my little carved policeman returned to his rightful spot by the flowers. A small but meaningful victory for reason and respect. So the next time you find yourself in a tug-of-war with an overzealous HOA, remember, knowing your rights and standing your ground can make all the difference. And if you ever catch your driveway blocked over a petty fine, don't lose hope. Sometimes, all it takes is a single voice to challenge an entire system. And you might be surprised how quickly the pillars of misplaced authority crumble under the weight of truth.